So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar on University in-house therapeutics development. This is Matt Cohen speaking. I'm a principal here at Osage University Partners on the Life Science Investment team. Briefly, I just wanted to say that we selected this topic really because in recent years, several of our university partner institutions have set up internally driven and funded therapeutics development programs that have helped provide faculty the opportunity to push some of their high impact translational projects, further than have been typically seen within an academic setting. And really these programs can oversee all stages of therapeutic discovery and development, from as early as hit discovery through clinical trials. So our goal here today is to explore the unique challenges facing academically driven therapeutics development programs through a discussion with our panelists. The panelists today are Matt Tremblay, Vice President of Business Development at the Scripps Research Institute and also Chief Operating Officer of the California Institute for Biomedical Research, also known as Caliber. We have Nadim Shohdy, Assistant Dean of Therapeutics Alliances at New York University's Langone Medical Center, and Leandro Vetcher, the Associate Director of Business Development of the Blavatnik Biomedical Accelerator at Harvard University. So we're going to start off today's conversation with each panelist providing a short introduction about their own therapeutic development programs, and we'll follow that up with a conversation. We're going to try to highlight differences in various program models, how each program was launched and funded. We'll discover how academia can help advance university-originated discoveries into tomorrow's medicines, and we'll be addressing a few questions during this webinar that we already received from a number of you, hopefully on the line today. We really do like questions, so if you have something you want to submit during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature on your toolbar. And in just a moment, you'll notice a poll appearing on your screen, so if you could please fill this out. We'd love to just know how many people are attending the webinar today. So I'm going to now turn to our speakers to very briefly introduce their institution's programs. Matt Tremblay, could you please kick us off and briefly introduce the program at Caliber and your role there?
Sure. Thanks, Matt, and happy to be here. So Caliber actually started in 2012 as kind of a pilot experiment. We in-licensed IP from Peter Schultz's lab and had some seed funding from Merck. And over the past 6 years, that's actually grown into a 130-person separate institute that functions under the Scripps Research Institute kind of umbrella. We've taken down funding from a number of different pharmaceutical partners and foundations as part of that. And then over the last year or two, we've started to scale that across all of Scripps and having seeded it with the IP from Pete Schultz's lab. And we now have, I would say, 5 to 10 PIs at Scripps who are really engaged and looking to advance their projects through Caliber. I think we'll get into some of the specific capabilities later, but as the whole, conceit of the topic suggests, we're developing those technologies through, bona fide drug candidates that we're either out licensing preclinically or actually taking into the clinic ourselves through this operation.
Great, thank you, Matt. Leandro, could you please introduce yourself and the Blavatnik program at Harvard?
Leandro Vetcher, I run business development efforts for the accelerator here at Harvard. The accelerator was created by the Office of Technology Development as another resource to provide our investigators, but also to fulfill our mission to bring the new knowledge that's generated at the university to our communities and patients. Our focus is to bridge the development gap. We have a strong business development focus. By that I mean that we try to align our funding with industry interests, being pharma, biotech, or venture investors. We had $45 million available for supporting our programs. We already provided about 15 of those. We funded more than 90 projects. and about 50 of those projects, 50% of the completed projects have been partnered already. And just to finish, the type of resources that we provide are funding, but not only that, we provide business development support, project management, external consultants where needed, entrepreneurs in residence, things like that. So that's sort of an introduction.
Great. Thanks, Leandro. Look forward to hearing more about that the rest of the discussion. Nadim, if you could please introduce yourself and your role at NYU and a little bit about the program there.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I'm Nadim. I'm the Assistant Dean and Director of the NYU Office of Therapeutics Alliances, or OTA. OTA is a relatively young department. We started almost 4 years ago exactly to basically serve as a drug discovery accelerator engine to really try to de-risk NYU academic research projects to the point where industry partnerships could be inked, could happen, whether with big pharma or with investors for new startups. So OTA, its mission is very similar to the overall goals of my colleagues on the panel. But the way we basically operate almost like an in-house virtual biotech, where we take on really the projects we take on, we almost run them as if they're small, nimble startups in everything but name only, where we're sort of heavily involved in overseeing the science that will de-risk the project to the point where an investor will say, let's do a deal, as well as the associated business development and marketing on that subset of projects that are in our pipeline, of course, in conjunction with our tech transfer office, the NYU Office of Industrial Liaison. So we started a few years ago. Our benchmarks are we've reviewed over 50 projects. We've taken on over 30 projects, and 9 of our projects have been partnered out to industry, either to big pharma or to startups. And our founding principle, ironically, even for a drug discovery accelerator, our founding principle is that universities are not good at drug discovery, but we're really good at understanding disease biology, and industry is really good at drug discovery. And what OTA does is basically try to increase the productive collisions between the academic biology projects and advance them to the point where industry could take it on. And we're basically trying to just de-risk the data and IP package to make it more attractive for investors to take on the risk and put in their resources to take it on in a startup or within a pharma deal.
Great. Thanks, Nadim. Glad you're with us today on the call. So, moving to the next the first section that we're going to discuss, and what you'll see on your screens for those listening in and watching on your computers is we have various discussion topics. We'll move through them, and for each discussion topics, we have a series of questions. So this may help you follow along with where we are in the discussion as we move through. So the first section today is, why do this at all? What's the purpose? And so, the first question I want to pose to Matt Tremblay is, what are the critical value drivers to really maximize financial return here? What do you look to build with each program that ultimately results in the best value for the institute?
Yeah, I think just to segue into that, I think why do this? I think at Scripps we saw, and over the past 20 years or so, there's been over a dozen drugs that have come out of Scripps. And when you reflect back on the value that was created overall, it's enormous. When you look at the amount of that value that came back to the institute that was available to reinvest in research, it was quite small, actually. So that was, for us, the simple reason why we did it. And then the question is, how do you drive better deal value? I actually think that probably half of it is business development, poise and acumen, and going after partnerships with the right mindset, and having another entity, whether it's an incubator or Caliber as actually a separate entity, I think creates a format for approaching partners from a different guise and not just from the university standpoint. And that makes them, think differently during negotiation. In terms of the real value drivers, I would say that represents about 50% of, your ability to increase, transaction value. And there it's all the concepts that Nadim just outlined, where, you're talking about doing key de-risking experiments. There may be some fairly simple and, high probability outcomes that the investigators just haven't taken it upon themselves to do. Some simple toxicity studies, sometimes just repeating critical in vivo proof of concept experiments with, really robust parameters that pharma folks are used to seeing, so that they get themselves into a more excited state about the program. I think things like that are relatively simple. And then, the final thing I'll say there is, in certain cases, it would require, significant investment in medicinal chemistry or protein engineering, for example, to get a composition of matter to a more advanced stage. And of course, that depends on the nature of the program.
Got it. And Nadim, let me ask you, is there a stage that you look to typically take your assets to where you think you maximize value, or is there something within those data packages that you view to be most critical?
So the simple answer is every project is different. And we basically want to take projects where there is a probability of an exit, a handover to industry. With that said, every project has its different sweet spot on when it could be partnered out into a good quality partnership. Some projects you need to have chemical matter, and you need to show data that chemical matter is on target, has decent drug properties and decent potency that could be then optimized in the hands of a startup or a pharma partner into a development candidate or whatnot. But then there are other projects we found where the field is so much hotter, where we can do quality partnerships far, far, far earlier, even before we have a hit or any chemical matter or a starting antibody or whatnot. So and again, we operate under the principle that academic medical centers are really good in biology and industry is better at drug discovery. So the earlier we can do the exit, the better. But at the same time, we have to balance that with the fact that we also want to capture the most value out of a partnership. So, and at the same time, resources are limited. We have a budget from NYU's internal monies that they give us every year to spend on projects to make different bets. So it's really a multiple shots on goal mentality. So we study every single project and sort of craft what are the steps to a potential exit and how can we take it there. But every stage is different, frankly, with every project, with regards to what are the de-risking steps to get to a good quality offer from an investor, or maybe even 2 or 3.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And, I think, from our perspective, that's very true. Every project that we look at from an investor perspective has to be looked at separately. So Matt, maybe going back to you for a second, I want to kind of address the next couple points or questions, which is, what does an institution need prior to starting something like this? But maybe even more importantly, under what circumstances should a university not put a program in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could sort of answer those at the same time by saying that I think what's critical is you need people who've, been in an industry environment and or, let's say, an investor environment for a while to be leading these programs and, working together with the PIs very closely. And that requires not only that you can attract and retain those types of people, but also that you have faculty who are going to be receptive to that. So I would say, the time not to do it, of course, you never know what content is out there that you're missing. So I don't think you would decide not to do it because you felt that the university didn't have the right technologies. But I think if you don't have a commitment to, maybe gently shift the culture to the point where the faculty are engaging in a program like this and willing to take direction from somebody who might be asking them to do some additional experiments or to allow someone else to do some additional experiments to make their, data package more robust, then I think that could be problematic. And I think we'll touch on it later, but, having support from executive management and leadership within the university or the institute, I think is critical for making a decision.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What degree of institutional support do you have at Scripps and Caliber, and what role are those folks needing to play after the program's already up and running?
Yeah, so I think we have, our situation represents kind of one extreme, because we actually started this with Peter Schultz running Caliber, and he was a professor at Scripps at the time. And actually, as a result of Caliber being pretty successful in terms of creating pretty significant financial returns for Scripps, Scripps asked him to become president of Scripps. And then that led to kind of convalescence with Caliber. And so we kind of had institutional support baked in from the very beginning. I think we got lucky in that sense, and we're happy about that. But I think you could scale that over to somewhere else and just say, I think you need at least someone who's in control of resources and who the faculty that you're expecting to participate are going to respect and listen to. I think you need somebody in that role, whether it's the president or at a large university, it may be a dean. I think that person needs to be very supportive, also willing to give some discretion to the people who are really operating the program on a day-to-day basis, and not try to dictate too much of the play-by-play.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and in the interest of time, I think we're going to move into the next section where we're going to get into some of these things we were just speaking about in more detail. And so, one of the things we just heard from Matt is you need the willingness of the faculty to want to participate. And so how you do this is probably important. So Leandro, haven't heard from you yet. So, I'd like to call on you and, maybe to talk a little bit about, how much work, as you do these and set these up, how much work do you actually do within the university? Maybe that's in a faculty's lab or in a research core versus, going externally to CROs. And if you go externally, to CROs, how do you think about working with those folks and how do you structure those deals?
Yeah, that's a great question. The availability of the CROs is key for our program. Particularly, we have adopted the virtual company model in a way. We only 3 people in our team: a chief scientific officer, somebody that deals with relationship with the PIs and the CROs and business development. About 50% of our funding goes to CROs, work at CROs. So I hope that gives you an idea of how important they are for us. But obviously depends on the specific program. There are some programs that require a unique expertise, and we do all the work at the PI's lab, obviously. But we do a lot of work with CROs. We take full advantage of that in order to de-risk our programs. Most of the time we structure this as a service. But we explore some, and we've done some revenue sharing agreements with CROs when the opportunity it's correct, that allows us to expand our efforts. When it makes sense, we explore that. They have different flavors, but in general, it's a revenue sharing agreement that we've done in a few occasions.
Got it. And Nadim, I think over at NYU in your group, you guys have some interesting ways of thinking about how you work with external CRO partners. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So similar to sort of Harvard's model, we rely a lot on CROs. We have, and so far they're all fee-for-service relationships. We've talked with some of them about more collaborative deals, but nothing's ever happened yet. But so far, we have a very significant network of CROs that provide a lot of different drug discovery services available for us. And these basically allow us to have the best capabilities that industry utilizes to put on the very, very diverse projects that we're working on, because no 2 projects are the same, even from the technology needs and the drug discovery capabilities. But at the same time, we also recognize we can't just give work to CROs and kind of hope for the best, as a lot of people in industry have always recognized from day one. So in addition to the network of CROs that are under service agreements, we also have a small mini army of really talented, really seasoned ex-pharma, ex-biotech veterans that we basically utilize as consultants and we populate them on whatever project, depending on the project's needs and that particular consultant's expertise and skill sets. And these are people who have had like 20, 25, 35 years of experience at big pharma. Some of them have approved drugs that they've invented that are being used by patients, and they've seen it all and have done it all. So we use them also to help us assess projects for the feasibility, as well as also help project manage the projects, whether it's CROs or the few ones that are even in the PI's lab, alongside the OTA staff. And by doing this sort of CRO consultants, the OTA staff, and the PI, with us controlling sort of the funding for these activities, it allows us to accomplish three things. It allows us to get the best drug discovery capabilities on NYU targets and disease pathways. It allows us to be very flexible, to get really customized, tailored, and quality solutions for all our de-risking needs, given the variability of projects. And the last thing is that people in academia recognize, it also goes a long way to address the reproducibility problem that people have always been complaining about in industry, as well as also in academia, because these relationships are all fee for service between the CROs and the consultants. So any positive data package we've helped generate that we're then showcasing to investors or pharma is seen by industry as more validated, frankly, in their eyes, because that data package was generated by a quality industry partner that is an impartial partner, because these CROs and consultants get paid whether the data looks good or not so good. So that's really, really not only helped us generate good data packages, but also allowed us to be well received when we go shop these projects around, which is the ultimate goal, to hand them off to industry.
Yeah, many times when we, in partnering discussions, our potential partners have used the same CROs for the same work. So yeah, that helps a lot with the credibility.
Great, thanks. And Nadim, we had a question come through on the Q&A panel, which I think is a really great question. So, CROs have industry people coming to them all the time, paying them lots of money to run their experiments. How do you at NYU get the CRO to even think about or consider working with NYU? And, what's the dollar magnitude of work that you really need to give them to even get them to become interested in working with you?
Right. So CROs, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes with different motivations and things like that. But they also, and we definitely don't have as deep a pocket as, let's say, if their client was Merck or Pfizer or Genentech. But at the same time, they like working with us for a number of reasons. The first is a lot of times they have capacity. So they want to take on more business. Their model is to generate money based on services. So they always have capacity and can take on more projects if they have capacity. The other thing is that, and we always convey this to them, is that while we tell them we don't have the deep pockets as big pharma or big VCs for our projects, but at the same time, what we have that pharma doesn't have is we have a revolving door of projects to work on, stemming from the very fertile soil of the 200 or 300 plus academic investigators at NYU every day working on potential new targets that could be the basis for new drug discovery projects with CROs. And that gets them because, they may not be, one project with NYU may not be as big, but if they do 5 projects over the course of a year with NYU, that sum total could be very impressive. And some industry, especially with small biotechs, even ones that are well funded, may only work on CROs on their 1 or 2 pipeline projects for the duration of the biotech's life. Whereas NYU, because we're an academic medical center, we can always give them repeat business. But at the same time, we still negotiate hard and we always try to lower the price. But they still, because of the capacity issues and because we can show them volume, especially if we've had successful interactions with them once or twice, why would we go to somebody else for a similar type of project? We come back to them again. So that type of thinking helps us with the CROs. And we have fantastic relationships with really fantastic CROs out there and really name brand ones.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple questions come through about, working with consultants, which we're going to get to in section 3. But for now, let's move on and talk about how you select projects to go forward with. Matt, maybe we could start with you. Do you use outside committees or advisors, and how do you engage them, and then how do you think about other things like the novelty of the target versus, a well-known target versus, first come, first serve versus unmet medical needs versus, is this institution even good at this therapeutic area or not? How do you balance all those things, and how do you go about selecting projects?
Yeah, we've done it. I would say maybe a little more intuitively than other places. We've not formed any formal committees. I think one advantage we have at Scripps is that a lot of the faculty have been pretty entrepreneurial and pretty successful in that regard. So we tend to use internal stakeholders in kind of an ad hoc fashion. I have kind of a set of 10 or so people that have, overlapping but wide-ranging expertise that I would go to and ask about different programs depending on the disease area. And first and foremost there is Peter Schultz, who has extremely broad and great intuition on drug discovery. So we tend to do it that way. I would say that we definitely focus on quality of the project, and I think we remain opportunistic on disease area or modality. I think most things people are working on, you can find your way to an unmet medical need, and otherwise they wouldn't be working on it typically. And it's really a matter of connecting what they're doing with, an actionable, let's say, initial clinical proof of concept, what's the path from where they are today to that, and working with them to understand whether they have a data package that would support that. I think that's generally how we look at it, and we probably don't have any kind. I think we, compared to the other panelists, we don't have a formal process for, let's say, taking in X number of projects per year. I think it's very much based on case by case and the quality of the work.
We actually don't have a formal process either. We don't do RFPs as part of our bread and butter operations. Our process to take on projects are continuous on a rolling basis. We're hitting the ground, always talking to postdocs, graduate students, PIs, going to lab meetings, going to retreats. Again, analogous to sort of how an investor would do it, always walking the halls, except they're our halls.
Well, this is Leandro. We actually have a little bit more formalized process, even though, as you all said, we constantly scouting and exploring opportunity with our faculty. But we actually have 2 cycles where we request proposals, and we receive what we call pre-proposals, and we do an initial selection, and then we dig a little deeper in our diligence, and then we present the proposals to an advisory committee that we relied significantly in order to align our decisions with what industry would like to see eventually.
And Leandro, I'm guessing sometimes in your formal process you have to say no to PIs.
Yes.
You ever get hard feelings or any political issues with having to say no, and how do you handle that?
That's a great question. It is a challenge, but we dealt with that very successfully in a couple of ways. One is that the final decision is made by this external advisory committee. Okay, so it's a very trusted industry and academics, very senior people. It's independent, and that helps. The second thing is that we provide very valuable feedback at the time of having to reject the proposal. We bring industry feedback into that. We bring our own feedback. We bring intellectual property analysis. And many times those investigators come back to us in the following cycle. So it's a very constructive process, even though we had to reject their proposal.
Thank you. So one of the questions folks are asking that we also have up on here on the screen is, as these things move forward, you have to ensure proper resource utilization and milestone achievement. So, Leandro, how do you keep an eye on maybe experiments the PI is doing, that aren't being done at a CRO to make sure, things are happening on time and, that the data that they said they generate, they're generating with the money that you give them?
Yeah, again, another great question. So we have an amazing resource in our accelerator called Sue Chang. She's been with Harvard for many years, and everybody knows her, and she knows everybody, and she meets with them with every project at least once a month. She developed a great trust with our PIs. So she meets with them. I try to meet them as often as possible also. So we keep a close interaction with our investigators. It is challenging, but we have dedicated resources for that. Obviously, we also have quarterly reports. We work closely with the Office of Technology Development in terms of patent filings or presentations that the investigators are about to do. Yeah, but that's how we keep pace with the work of the PIs.
And how often, may Sue, reaching out to them? Is this a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? How aggressive do you need to be?
Definitely once a month. Definitely once a month with each of them. Yes.
Okay. Great.
And if we need to do it more often, we will do it too.
Yep. Another question that we wanted to make sure we address, Nadim, maybe is have you ever done these projects in collaboration with pharma? And if you do, there's a couple questions related to that. One is, how often do you collaborate with pharma at all to make sure that you're generating the kind of data that they care about? And then if you're actually working with them in a more formal way, how do you maximize IP rights retention when you're collaborating?
Right. So in fact, one of our deals is actually a co-development partnership that was announced earlier this summer with Therapeutics. That basically, so that was a situation where we were working on a certain drug target discovered from our PI's lab in glioblastoma, in brain cancer, and we had generated additional data package on target validation, assay development, and whatnot. And then we started talking with them, and they really liked the story. There was a lot of synergy for reasons I can't get into, but they thought that the stage was still too early for them to take it on completely. So what we ended up doing was we ended up basically developing a co-development agreement where for the first 12 months roughly, we would both be providing in-kind services to de-risk the project further. And at the end of that period, if it looked good, then the company would take it on completely, and we would get milestones, royalties, and so on. So the relationship was structured on the IP basically like a typical out-license deal, except with additional commitments on that co-development phase for the first year. And of course, the term sheet was obviously better than an analogous project if we weren't putting in additional resources either before the deal via OTA or after the deal in the first 12 months. So it's all about just recognizing how we can create value and creating valuable assets that can then be, that pharma could then work on with their resources. And for the projects where we're collaborating with pharma, where we're both providing in-kind resources, is generally structured like a typical out-license deal, but with better terms and better bells and whistles about how we're going to work together jointly with our respective teams.
Great, thank you. So I think in the interest of time, and we're starting to get questions about the who part of this, is, who do you need to do this? So, Matt, we'd love to hear from you, who runs the program on a day-to-day basis? Are there certain skill sets that person should have? And, where do you go about even finding people with that kind of talent?
Yeah, so at Caliber, again, we took a little bit different approach. We set up essentially a separate institute within the institute, and we hired in, I would say, two types of folks. We hired in principal investigators who would be not focused on their own research the way that faculty are, but focused on a small portfolio of drug discovery projects. And we have something like 6 of those folks in biology. And they have a number of projects that are sourced typically from the faculty, but they really take ownership working with the faculty if it's a faculty who wants to be, directly involved in an ongoing sense, or even in some ways transitioning the project. To support those, what we call principal investigators, we have a number of core directors. So we'll have a director of pharmacology, director of toxicology, director of translational medicine, and a pharmaceutical sciences, and then I guess medicinal chemistry and protein engineering. So for all of the kind of functional areas, we have folks that have responsibility across a number of projects for support. They have staff that do experiments internally, but then those are also the key people to interface with CROs in their respective domains. So we've organized it much like kind of a mid-sized biotech company, and then that interfaces with the PIs, the faculty at Scripps.
Thanks. And Nadim, you mentioned that you guys engage consultants. So how do you find consultants that have the proper talent, and then how do you retain them and keep them working with you?
So it's basically a lot of word of mouth, okay? Because we can't just look at a CV. I mean, that's one part, but we don't know how that person is going to work well with our PIs, with us, especially when you're talking about academic data that tends to be a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more raw. So there's a lot of word of mouth between our, from our advisors, from our network. And then we basically hire them as paid consultants. We pay them by the hour, no different the way they're retained for diligence or project management by a VC or a biotech company. And they like working with us because, again, the volume aspect is we give them lots of stuff. And they also a lot of them like working with universities. They think the science is cooler than from industry.
Got it. And Leandro, given your model where you probably, do a number of experiments in the faculty's labs, how much or little faculty involvement do you need or is required to get, to have success with this? And is there anything you need faculty to avoid doing that could be detrimental?
Well, we completely depend on the faculty involvement, independent of whether we do work in their labs or with a CRO. So the proposals for the work come from them directly, even though we get very involved in the process of evaluating it, and we might provide feedback that might change the direction of that proposal before we fund it or after we fund it. But it comes from them. They're absolutely committed to this. If they're not, we're not going to fund it. Also, what we've seen in our successful cases is the role of the postdocs. That's key as well. Whether they're committed to develop a product or they're challenged by the fact that they're thinking also about their publications and theses and all that. That's another level that we looked at in terms of commitment and focus. The person who's going to be actually doing the work in the lab.
Got it. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think a number of people would have the question of, where do I even start? How do I even go about finding these people? Are there online resources or is it word of mouth? How do you identify good people and know that they're good?
Yeah, let me take on that because, we're discussing what do you need, who do you need, and in something like this. And for us, our advisory committee, it's key. It's very, very, very important. Again, I know that Harvard spent a lot of time in building this committee, and we tap into them for many things, including identifying the best consultants. So these are, people who have started multiple companies, they're currently investing, they're making big decisions, very senior positions in companies, and they have a lot of experience. And a recommendation from any of them for us, it's key before we hire a consultant. So that's how we use them in order to identify consultants, but it's a key component for any in-house therapeutic development program, establishing a very strong advisory committee.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to the section 4 in the interest of time, which is, what does it cost to do this? You know, we just heard recently that you have to pay, if you're gonna use external consultants, you have to pay them. We had a question on the Q&A that was, do you pay external advisory committees? And Leandro answered that there and said, you know, they're not paid, you know, they're just interested in helping Harvard, which is great. So, you know, but ultimately the money has to come, you know, from somewhere, and it's not trivial. So, Leandro, you know, what does it cost, you know, to do therapeutics development within a university? You mentioned your fund's $45 million. So how many projects? What does that really go to?
We fund programs at 2 levels. What we call a pilot level, which is a little bit more proof of concept, exploratory, with the hope of generating more advanced programs that we can continue funding. The second level is around $300,000, and we hope that after we provide that level of funding, we have something that is of a high interest to investors or companies that's partnerable. We probably fund you know, about 6 pilot programs and, you know, 3 or 4 development programs per year. So that should give you an idea of how we use some of our resources. But yeah, those are that's how we allocate most of our funds for supporting this type of project. We have one key aspect is that we have the flexibility of providing additional funding to these projects in a very quick and non-bureaucratic way. If we're in the middle of partner negotiations and those discussions request generating some additional data, we can very rapidly generate that data, which I think it's a very, very important point for the audience to take. You need to find ways to have mechanisms to respond quickly if you want to do in-house drug development. So we have some funds allocated for that.
Great. And Matt Tremblay, you mentioned perhaps even taking projects through into clinical development, which most people would feel is very expensive. So, you know, can you give you know, at least the people a sense for, you know, how much does it cost to if you ever wanted to do something like that, what is that going to cost?
Yeah, so we actually don't have any institutional monies committed to this program. So we've only you know, built up a budget based on partnerships and sponsored research that we've established. So Caliber's budget, just to give you the high level view, has ranged over the past few years between $30 and $40 million a year, and we're operating typically 30 projects. We have more in the hopper, but in earnest 30 projects, and they're each taking up very different amounts of resources. To your point that for the 3 or 4 projects that we have that are in IND enabling studies, and one project is entering the clinic early next year, those take a lot of resources. We haven't had the flexibility to do that unless we have a specific grant or partnership in place to support that. In the case of our first program entering the clinic, we had a preclinical grant from CIRM, California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and then kind of stepped through their process. And as they saw the data unfold, then they committed more money, and they've just recently committed $9 million to put that into a phase 1 study, which includes assessing biomarkers in patients as well as safety. So that's, and I think that's a pretty, you know, typical cost, although, you know, every phase 1 is going to be quite different. So I think for us, we've sought interesting partnerships. Obviously, in terms of value creation, it's better not to completely lock up the program with a partner if you're trying to, take it to a further de-risked stage, because you're trying to create exposure to that value. But whether it's with a granting agency or maybe an option-based structure from a partner, there's ways to get the resources to do those experiments.
This is Leandro. So perhaps to add a little bit more flavor to the numbers that I share with you, typically for the pilots that I told you, that are around $100,000, we do target discovery and validation, we do some screening, and for the development grants, usually do lead optimization, monoclonal antibody development, a lot of clinical work, animal models. In some cases, we've been able to go to some preclinical, late preclinical work. So we have the ability to provide more funding for that if necessary.
Got it. And so, Matt, you mentioned some creative places to find these financial resources to enable these programs across various stages. Maybe a question for Matt or Leandro, either of you can jump in, but are there particular funding mechanisms that have been most helpful, either seeking them internally or externally?
For us, I think, when you get to a stage of having a candidate compound in hand, so you're looking at doing IND enabling studies and or clinical studies, we definitely look first to the foundations and granting agencies. Those tend to have longer time horizons. So, and also you need to find a really good fit, but we have had good luck there. We've had, I think 4 programs in total taken through IND enabling studies with foundation partners. So Wellcome Trust, California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, the Gates Foundation. The next level down, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but would be to, sell an option to a pharma partner. And we've done that as well. So we had a program that we put in place, an exclusive option with Pfizer, and they paid us an upfront payment that essentially we used to conduct the studies to take that molecule through IND enabling studies. And it will enter the clinic after that as part of that option payment. And then they have a set of terms that they can exercise after we complete the phase 1. And those terms are, somewhat commensurate with what the asset would be worth at that stage. Obviously, there's some discount in there because they're taking a risk with the money up front, but it isn't the same deal magnitude as you'd be able to get with just a pure preclinical asset. So there you're kind of, I would say that the overall point is if you get that operating capital from a pharma partner, you're going to compromise ultimately on the downstream value, but it's still something that we find worth doing.
Go ahead, Leandro.
Yeah, in our case, it's a much simpler answer. We received a very generous gift from the Blavatnik Family Foundation that allow us to fund the programs ourselves. Obviously, Harvard does a lot of strategic alliances with pharma and biotech. That doesn't necessarily goes through the accelerator. We help, we enable a lot of those in a way by the data that we generate. But the programs that go through the accelerator, we fund directly through a gift.
Got it. And then, maybe to close out on this section, have either of you built in an evergreen model where if you're successful, will any of the money come back into the program?
Yes, this is Leandro. We have an evergreen model. We receive part of the revenues that Harvard gets from licensing the programs that we accelerate. Yeah, so we get a chunk of those revenues, either when a company gets started or a license to establish company. We get a percentage of that goes to our current and future operations.
Yeah, Matt, this is Matt Tremblay. We've pretty explicitly built that into our program at Caliber. In fact, that was the driving motivation for doing it. And we've actually already experienced a pretty significant utilization of that. So one of our early programs was out licensed to Bristol Myers, and we received an upfront payment that actually allowed us to engage at an earlier stage than we otherwise would have a whole bunch of projects that were not sponsored or partnered with anyone in particular, nor with the Institute. But we've already started to kind of deploy that mechanism of having a war chest of funds that we can use for discretionary projects, and then seeing some of the returns coming back from that investment.
Great. So in the interest of time, let's move to section 5, which is, how do you measure success? Leandro, let's start with you. Are there metrics you're using to measure success? And if you have a success story, I would love to hear it.
Sure. So our main goal is to bring these programs to industry partners, either a new company or established company, or a large strategic alliance that Harvard can sign with one of our partners. That's our main goal. That's our main goal, and we keep a good track of that. As I told you earlier, about 50% of the completed programs have been partnered. So that's our goal. Obviously, we have an interest in promoting entrepreneurship within the university, generating value for a program, and for the university. But our main goal is to bring better opportunities to our partners so they can take it through the clinic and to the patients.
And Leandro, we had a specific question come through that I thought was interesting, was whether or not this types of your program there maybe is helping contribute to faculty recruitment or retention, and have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, we haven't measured that, but we have that in mind. Obviously, we always looking for the new investigators that come to us, and we hope that the different schools and departments highlight the availability of our accelerator. I think we had some very important success cases that have helped promote the accelerator within the university and outside the university. One example is the deal that we signed with Merck last year. We were able to get $20 million as an upfront payment, and that definitely generated a lot of attention within the university for investigators to come and talk with us even more than what we were doing before that.
And Matt, would love to, you mentioned the BMS success story. Maybe for folks who are thinking about starting these, it sounds like a great story. So maybe you could share, 60 seconds worth of, a little bit more about that project if you can.
Yeah, sure. So that's an example of something that we out-licensed, or I should say that we, collaborated on with Pete Schultz's lab at Scripps. And again, it was a molecule from a phenotypic screen that had been done in his lab. And I would say, by investing something on the order of $1 to $2 million over the course of 2.5 years, we took that from what was otherwise an academic level asset to something that, we were able to get. I think we didn't disclose the exact financials, but 8-figure upfront payment, low double-digit royalties, and several $100 million in potential milestones. Basically, a deal that you would see on fierce biotech between an established biotech and a pharma, and that was a pretty big precedent setting for us. I think we've replicated that a couple of times since then. I think that's the true metric of success is really deal magnitude and deal flow. I think some of the other things, I'll just add my 2 cents, that I think recruiting and also philanthropy and just general engagement by the community is something that is we've seen be very positively impacted by this. And I think, there's many people that have made a lot of money in this industry, and I think they're attracted to new ways of doing it, and they're looking to support it not only with their time, but in some cases with their resources and their connections.
Yeah, Matt, you mentioned faculty being interested in doing drug discovery and a little bit about making some money. Do you share licensing revenue from this work with inventors and faculty if it's been industry funded, or how do you do that? Does the faculty get incentivized by the potential to make some money?
Yeah, this has always been a point of discussion, and it's really kind of a long whiteboard discussion if you really get into it. But sure, we have a buy-dole policy for distributing revenues to inventors, and then the faculty lab will also get a portion of that to the extent that comes back as licensing revenue. If you contrast, let's say you're investing in a program internally to take it to a larger, direct license with pharma, you're making the pie bigger. So they're, the incentive for them is that they're getting, the same piece of a much bigger pie. If you contrast that with a sort of a faculty originated startup that might be independent of the university, they're, at least at Scripps, they're able to get their buy-dole percentage as well as independent shares in the company as scientific co-founders and advisors and whatnot. And, the curves cross depending on how successful the program is and at what stage it exits. But I think in general, what we try to, describe to people to compel them is that it's not so much that you could take a success story of somebody being an independent co-founder and, show how much money that they've made, but actually the probability that happens is typically pretty low if you don't have the support of the institution and if you don't have the support of the network and the kind of infrastructure that we've been talking about today. So we usually try to get faculty on board by mostly talking about the probability that their science has impact on patients, and that any one of these potential mechanisms that they can share in that comes to be. And I think that usually works pretty well.
Great, thanks. So, prior to the final question and, before we run out of time here, we would love to collect today's attendees' feedback on our webinar. You'll notice a link to a feedback survey in your chat box. If you could please fill it out, we would greatly appreciate that. So to close, Matt, Leandro, Nadim, for the institutions currently thinking about starting or in the early stages of a program for in-house therapeutics development, what number one piece of advice would you give them?
This is Matt. I could start. I would just say, although things like this, the webinar is an excellent way to get started thinking about it. I would say, try to connect one-on-one with people like the panelists who've done this, and maybe offer to come out and sit with them for a couple of hours and really pick their brain on how they started it, some of the nitty-gritty of how they started it, what the pitfalls were. And for us, again, I'll just mention that alignment with leadership at the Institute is really important. But I think kind of getting a play-by-play from someone who's done it would be the way that I would recommend starting it.
My suggestion would be to invest a lot of time recruiting a very experienced advisory committee from industry and from within the institution. That you probably have some investigators with entrepreneurial experience. So invest the time on that. That's going to help you a lot. The second thing I would highlight is leverage your connections with industry, with your potential partners, either through your tech transfer office or advisory committee, or obviously your own network, and talk with them frequently, and make sure that whatever you're funding, because your resources are going to be limited no matter what, are very focused, very targeted in de-risking and creating value. So at the end of the day, you have something that your partners would like to take. So there are many recommendations, but probably those are the two that I will highlight. I mean, I guess one third one I will highlight is, for us, it's also very important, the resources that we use from the Office of Technology Development, our tech transfer office. So for us, that link is very important. We actually part of OTD, and we use a lot of resources from them. From the intellectual property, attorneys, transactions, you name it. So that could be an interesting strategy to start your own in-house program from your tech transfer.
Great, thank you. So thank you again to Matt, Leandro, and Nadim. Great discussion today. If any of you have additional questions for our speakers, please reach out to them by the email address you can see on the slide on your screens, or feel free to reach out to Natasha or myself and we can help connect you. Thanks everyone for your participation in the webinar today, and please enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Matt.